what the new dockworkers agreement means for shippers, new trends in artificial intelligence and data science, and the difficulty in finding warehouse space. Pull up a chair and join us as the editors of DC Velocity discuss these stories as well as news and supply chain trends on this week's Logistics Matters podcast. Hi, I'm Dave Maloney. I'm the Group Editorial Director at DC Velocity. Welcome. Logistics Matters is sponsored by CSEMP Edge 2025. New year, new you. It's time to level up at CSEMP's Edge 2025 Supply Chain Conference. Mark your calendar for October 5th through 8th at the Gaylord National in Washington to join supply chain's best to gain cutting-edge insights and elevate your career. As a Logistics Matters listener, save $500 on registration with code LOGISTICS. Start your year strong and secure your spot at Edge 2025. Go to csempedge.org to learn more. As usual, our DC Velocity senior editors Ben Ames and Victoria Kickham will be along to provide their insights into the top stories of this week. But to begin today, at what seemed like the 11th hour, dock workers and ports on the East and Gulf Coast agreed to a new contract. What will labor peace mean for shippers? To find out, here is Ben with today's guest. Ben?
Thank you, Dave. That's right. This is the big story that we were covering this week, was the possibility of another dock worker strike at the U.S. East Coast and Gulf Coast ports. That could have stopped the flow of containers and goods at 14 different ports up and down the eastern seaboard and in the Gulf of Mexico, of course, just as it did, in fact, for about 3 days back in October, which is the last time this labor contract was negotiated. That strike ended fairly quickly, and fortunately for all involved, this one seems to have stopped before it even began. Here today to talk about the details of how we got here is Ian Wilson. He's a senior data analyst with Everstream, which is a California company that provides supply chain risk analytics. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate you inviting me to be here today.
So, Ian, in terms of sort of what the crisis was that we were all sort of clenching for here as the week went on, just how much was at stake with this possible port strike? How much of an impact could it have made?
Yeah, well, I think you really hit the nail on the head with kind of crisis averted. It's definitely would have been hugely impactful to maritime shipping, not just in the United States, but also on a global scale as well, too, just because as vessels bunch up at certain ports, as they have to maybe divert to alternative ports, that has ripple effects on the efficiency of other ports worldwide. So a strike at the East and Gulf Coast ports this week would have just been hugely impactful. Really, East and Gulf Coast ports handle about 50% of imports into the United States, everything from agricultural products and time-sensitive goods such as medical devices and technology products, and then even bigger into agricultural machinery, finished automotives coming into East Coast ports. These types of things would have been delayed or been forced to be rerouted to other alternative ports, which just costs time, costs money, just passes on costs all the way down through the supply chain. So I think some of the initial estimates we were looking at for the earlier strike that occurred in October at the East and Gulf Coast ports was about $5 billion of cost per day. So any strike of any length happening this week would have just been hugely impactful and really just delayed things, caused congestion all across the United States and into the world as a whole.
Yikes. Now, you mentioned some delays, some rerouting, and I know from covering the strike in October that before the strike ever happened or didn't, a number of shippers had already made some of those decisions to reroute in order to avoid the potential of a backup. So in other words, the strike doesn't even necessarily have to occur in order to make those ripples. To what extent might that have happened this time?
Yeah, exactly. And we saw this, I'm sure you all remember several years ago on the West Coast, kind of a similar scenario unfolded, contract negotiations for port workers. And there was a lot of cargo diversion to the East Coast. And then now we're kind of seeing the pendulum effect of now that we have the East and Gulf Coast negotiation, the alternative ports become the West Coast. So definitely as we were kind of scenario planning with our clients and getting them prepped for, okay, what does a full strike mean? What would, a partial strike with work to rule orders, like overtime limits and stuff like that, what type of impacts would those have? One of the contingency plans that a lot of our clients were developing was diverting cargo to the West Coast. But I think kind of uniquely with this East and Gulf Coast strike, what we've seen is actually kind of a front loading of cargo. We saw about a 10 to 15% increase in cargo vessel traffic coming into East and Gulf Coast ports before that strike in October. And then we saw a similar increase of about 10% kind of happening through December, and really that plummeted in early January as we got closer to this potential strike. So I think, there was a few factors outside of the strike as well too. There was, kind of geopolitical factors. There was, kind of the presidential transition, maybe the tariffs that are coming, in early 2025, who knows what's happening with that. But some of those factors as well, I think certainly played into companies' decisions to try to get imports into the United States before these hugely disruptive events, such as the East Coast and Gulf Coast port strike and potential, broad tariffs that could be imposed by President-elect Donald Trump.
Right. So you mentioned some of those external issues, and sort of keys into my next question there. Now that we appear to have peace at the ports, does that mean that conditions are perfectly smooth and easy for shippers and carriers? And I ask that with tongue in cheek.
Yeah, no, I think, when you look at it, I kind of think sometimes about being a camera lens, and so when we look at it, we zoom into East and Gulf Coast ports, we can kind of anticipate that probably the disruptions will be mostly gone from this potential event in the next week or so. So we should see a pretty short-term resolution, maybe a few bumps on the road of just there were a couple of rail carriers, for example, that had put embargoes on cargo going to East and Gulf Coast ports. So just some time for all of those to kind of trickle out and normalize. But I think when we zoom out and kind of look at the broader picture in the United States and then globally as well too, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of factors that could continue to impact maritime shipping. You obviously have the change in power in the United States. That's going to come with its own set of challenges and new challenges to navigate in 2025. We also still have the Red Sea crisis, which is still kind of ongoing. And then the ripple effects from that are increased congestion at other ports. And as we kind of mentioned earlier, as if one port gets disrupted and that causes vessel disruptions, schedule issues, that just trickles out to other ports and really impacts the efficiency of the entire system. So definitely not smooth sailing, but I think everyone will be breathing a sigh of relief this week anyways, that we at least have one big question mark taken off the table with the resolution for this East and Gulf Coast strike.
And speaking of the resolution, do you have any sort of details on how they reached that? This was the agreement, of course, between the dock workers, or the longshoremen, I guess, the ILA union, and the port operators, USMX, I think.
Yes. Yep. United States Maritime Alliance and International Longshoremen's Association. I think that, in October, they were able to reach an agreement on wages. So the proposal was about a 62% increase for port workers over the life of this new contract. That seemed to be agreeable to everybody, but the issue they were still hung up on was the continuing issue of automation in ports. How does that impact job security for port workers? And the ILA, of course, wants to protect its union members, and the USMX is, of course, looking to be as efficient as possible, bring ports as much into the future as they possibly can. So that was really the piece in the negotiations that was getting everybody hung up. That was the piece that was kind of causing this fraction kind of at the negotiating table. So I think that really that was the key agreement that was reached in this deal that couldn't be reached in October, was a little bit more of an agreement on what type of automation. We don't know exactly what that is because both sides have agreed to kind of withhold all information about the contract until after it's ratified. But we do know that the USMX has secured some provisions for new technology in the port, and the ILA has also secured some provisions for protections for its workers and an increase in jobs at these ports in this new contract. So both sides kind of got a little bit of what they want. We just don't know exactly what the language is around those automation developments and technological developments that could be coming as part of this new contract.
Interesting. And maybe to dig in a little more, talking about that automation, Do you have a sense of sort of what exactly automation means here? I mean, it could be remotely operated gantry cranes or like fully autonomous yard trucks, maybe self-driving trucks, that kind of thing, or what is it that we're talking about?
Yeah, for sure. I think the point that the ILA kept bringing up was that the United States Maritime Alliance had already implemented this automation technology, and really the key one that they had a problem with, the key piece of technology, was these semi-automated rail gantry cranes at ports. And so these are the cranes that offload, onload containers onto ships. That was kind of what they were having issues with, and so I'm not sure if they were just trying to kind of keep the spread of those into other ports. But they've also said in other places that, okay, we can continue to have ILA jobs with some of this semi-automated equipment. So I don't know if that piece of technology was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. But I also know that the United States Maritime Alliance had talked a lot about, okay, when you look at the rest of the world, when you look at these major ports in Asia, they have entire terminals that are operating completely remotely, completely autonomously, without really a lot of human input. And that's kind of what they were, I think, maybe looking to maybe measure their United States ports by. But I'm not sure whether or not the United States Maritime Alliance was really aiming towards that, like a fully automated terminal somewhere in the United States, just because we have a different shipping environment than a lot of those ports in Asia. So it may not even make sense to have that type of technology here. But I do think that in a large, to kind of boil it down, the ILA was just really worried that the USMX was going to be replacing workers, decreasing the amount of union workers at ports, and instead bringing in technology that is just taking those workers' jobs. And so that was kind of the, whatever, that's the bucket. And then whatever piece of technology you kind of want to put into the bucket that could be concerning, I think, that's kind of what we were talking about in this negotiation.
Got it. Got it. This has been really interesting, Ian. We only have a minute left, but before I let you go, I wanted to touch on a different topic here because the challenges never end in supply chain. Of course, there are ongoing, really terrifying wildfires in Los Angeles area right now. Do you have any feeling for what the latest might be on how that is affecting supply chain operations?
Yeah, I think that has been a hugely impactful news topic that's really developed overnight this week. And as you said, one disruption goes away, another one comes up. I think from a supply chain perspective, of course, there's always the human impact of the wildfire that's been tremendous. But from a supply chain perspective, I don't think the impacts have been quite as severe as maybe people feared when the fires initially broke out. A lot of the fires have been in more residential areas and haven't really hit industrial areas per se. Of course, there's always outliers of office buildings and isolated manufacturing facilities that have been impacted. But as far as major industrial areas, we haven't seen the disruptions there. We haven't seen a lot of flight disruptions at Los Angeles International Airport, and we haven't seen any port disruptions at the Port of Los Angeles or Long Beach yet. There have been some scattered interstate closures and highway closures. I think I-10, I-210, I-5 have seen some small closures in localized areas around the fires. And really, we're watching the Hearst fire and the Eaton fire are the two ones that seem like they could be most impactful to industrial areas. They're kind of the ones that are closest to that. The other two fires just don't seem to pose the highest risk for industrial areas specifically, but again, are still kind of contributing to the overall risk environment of that area right now.
Got it. Got it. Thank you for sharing the latest. Ian, we really appreciate your coming on the show and catching us up to date. It's been a busy week. Thank you for being here.
Of course. Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
Our guest this week has been Ian Wilson from Everstream. Back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Ian and Ben. Now let's take a look at some of the other supply chain news from the week. And Victoria, you wrote this week about 5 trends in artificial intelligence and data science for 2025. Can you share the details?
Absolutely. Yeah. So this comes from a report in the MIT Sloan Management Review, which caught my attention this week. Researchers Tom Davenport and Randy Bean wrote about 5 key trends in AI and data science that all businesses should be paying attention to this year. As you know, AI has become a very hot topic in logistics circles in the past couple of years. So, any research that sheds light on how this technology is affecting business and commerce is something we want to pay attention to. The five trends range from the promise of agentic AI to the struggle over which C suite role should oversee data and AI responsibilities.
Victoria, AI always seems like such a big, complex topic, and it sort of sounds like this research breaks it down into some specific points. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And I agree. AI can be a daunting subject to research and to write about. This particular research is part of an ongoing series of columns called AI in Action. And I can expand on a couple of the points just to give you a taste of it. I mentioned the rise of agentic AI. This is AI that handles tasks independently, mainly in the form of generative AI bots. Think of asking ChatGPT to give you a summary of some topic or idea. The authors say that while this is on the rise and lots of companies are experimenting with it, it's still going to be a long time before those kinds of tools can handle really big tasks like making a travel reservation or conducting a banking transaction. Another trend is in measuring results from AI experiments. The authors say that very few companies are taking the time to carefully measure productivity gains from AI projects, particularly when it comes to figuring out what their knowledge-based workers are doing with all that freed up time those Gen AI projects in particular are supposed to provide. They say doing so is really vital to benefiting from all these AI investments. There's a lot more to the research. Readers can check it out in our story, which includes a link to the MIT Sloan Management review piece.
Victoria, it does seem like AI is moving so fast that it's hard to keep up with all the innovation surrounding it.
It sure is. Yeah,
Thank you, Victoria.
you're welcome.
And Ben, with interest rates and building costs very high now, it's expensive to build a new distribution facility these days. And you wrote this week that's just about how difficult it is to find available warehouse space. Can you share more?
Yeah, I'm glad to. This is, of course, we often talk about the more flashy aspects of logistics, like the latest news in technology and transportation in the first couple segments of this. But the real foundation of logistics operations, of course, is material handling and finding the warehouse space to store your inventory. So, a story that caught my eye this week was a report that showed we're in a part of the business cycle where it can be pretty difficult to find enough warehouse space to rent or lease, whether you're a manufacturer or a retailer or a 3PL. This came from a quarterly measurement from the big commercial real estate firm Cushman and Wakefield that said that the overall national industrial real estate vacancy rate had edged higher in the fourth quarter just passed. More vacancy, of course, means that it's easier to find a place to rent. Although vacancy still, Cushman and Wakefield pointed out, remains well below the pre-pandemic levels when it was much easier to find space. So, for some perspective, vacancy rates, they had shrunk during the pandemic to historically low levels. That's because of the e-commerce sales and thus the demand for extra warehouse space were booming in response to massive numbers of people working and living from home. That frantic pace couldn't last forever, and it's now cooling off. But real estate demand for those warehouses, particularly e-commerce warehouses, still remains elevated from a long-term perspective.
Well, Ben, it's easy to understand how the pandemic definitely disrupted a lot of the normal patterns, but did the report explain why warehouse space is still so tight?
Yeah, they gave a few reasons, and the best explanation came from the following quote here that came from Cushman and Wakefield's Jason Tolliver. He's their president for logistics and industrial services. So Tolliver said that we've witnessed an uptick among firms looking to lease larger buildings to support their omni-channel fulfillment strategies and to maintain inventory for their e-commerce and wholesale and retail stock. That trend is not just about space, but also efficiency and customer satisfaction. And meanwhile, we're also seeing a flurry of activity to support forward deployed stock models. That's a strategy that keeps products closer to the market that they serve and where customers order from, thus promising quicker deliveries and happier customers. He sort of put his finger on a lot of the mega trends that we're seeing in logistics now. So far, he's been talking about a collection of those long-term trends. They show no sign of slowing down. So overall, the company concluded that we'll probably see warehouse real estate space start to tighten up again soon. Again, in Cushman & Wakefield's words, industrial vacancy is likely nearing its peak for this cooling cycle in the coming quarters. Again, they're sort of looking at it from the vacancy side, but to translate, that means that vacancy right now is about as big as it's going to get for the near future, and that free space is probably on track to shrink again soon.
Well, Ben, that might be another good reason to look at automation of being able to fit more capacity and capability into a smaller footprint.
That would be a good strategy. You got to take full advantage of every square foot you have.
Right? Thank you, Ben.
Glad to.
We encourage listeners to go to dcvelocity.com for more on these and other supply chain stories. Also, check out the podcast notes section for some direct links to read more about the topics that we discussed today. And we'd like to thank Ian Wilson of Everstream Analytics for being our guest. We welcome your comments on this topic and our other stories. You can email us at podcast@agilebme.com. We also encourage you to subscribe to Logistics Matters at your favorite podcast platform. Our new episodes are uploaded on Fridays. And a reminder that Logistics Matters is sponsored by CSCMP Edge 2025. New year, new you. It's time to level up at CSCMP's Edge 2025 Supply Chain Conference. Mark your calendar for October 5th through 8th at the Gaylord National in Washington to join supply chain's best to gain cutting-edge insights and elevate your career. As a Logistics Matters listener, save $500 on registration with code LOGISTICS. Start your year strong and secure your spot at Edge 2025. Go to cscmpedge.org to learn more. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Logistics Matters. Be sure to join us. Until then, have a great week.